I've seen a lot of things in this war, but nothing like that. Draken's voice carried a weight that stilled the air around him. The bar, once buzzing with fragmented conversations, grew unnervingly quiet. The soft clink of a glass settling on a metal counter echoed louder than it should. Every eye was on him now. Captain Varric Solane leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing. "You've got our attention, Drakane. You saying you walked away from Venar 7 alive?" Drakane's cybernetic eye flickered, the red glow momentarily illuminating the lines of exhaustion on his face. He glanced at his drink, rolling it in his hand before raising his gaze to meet Varric's. "No," he said quietly. "I didn't walk away. I died there alongside the rest of my squad." He paused, the tension thick as starship hull plating. "But then I saw a human do the impossible, and I knew we weren't fighting the kind of war we thought we were." The bar's cold lights hummed in the background, casting faint reflections across scarred faces and battered armor. War-weary veterans leaned in closer, their breathing slow and steady, eyes locked on Drakane as he began to speak again. "It started in the heart of Venar 7, he said, voice low but steady. "A day after the Hive broke through our outer defenses. The sky was bleeding red from the fallout clouds. Hive drones swarmed like waves, their war cries vibrating in our skulls through our neural comms. We'd been holding the western perimeter for days, longer than anyone thought possible. My squad was running on desperation and what little energy rations we had left." The memory hit like a fist to his gut. He could almost feel the ground rumbling beneath him again, smell the metallic tang of burning biosteel mixing with the sour scent of sweat and battlefield rot. "I knew we wouldn't last the night," Drakane continued. "Our shields were down. The heads-up displays in our visors flickered with error codes faster than we could process. Every corner of the outpost felt like a death trap. That's when I met him, Corporal Zaid Morran." He stopped, his eyes sharpening, as if daring anyone to dismiss what he was about to say. No one did. He wasn't like the others. He didn't flinch when the Hive breached the secondary wall. Hell, he didn't even duck when plasma fire ripped through the air inches from his head. While the rest of us were trying to survive, Zayed was watching, calculating, and then he smiled. Varric arched a brow. "He smiled?" Drakane nodded. "Not the kind of smile you give when you're feeling brave. It was the kind of smile you give when you already know how the story ends." He leaned back in his chair, cybernetic fingers tapping lightly on the table. And the story was his. The bar was silent except for the faint crackle of static from a nearby speaker. Drakane's voice grew darker. "When the Hive came through the breach, Zayed didn't just fight them. He toyed with them. He moved like a ghost, always one step ahead, taking out squads with surgical precision, his plasma-edged glaive cutting through their armor like it wasn't even there. Until they got him," Varric said quietly. Drakane nodded again, slowly this time. "I saw it happen with my own eyes. The Hive commander struck him down, straight through the chest with one of those scythe arms. He dropped to the ground, lifeless. His jaw tightened. We were forced to fall back, leaving his body behind. There was nothing we could do." He paused, eyes distant for a heartbeat too long. But hours later, when we regrouped at the lower barricade, there he was, standing, alive. The veterans around him stirred uneasily, their body language betraying disbelief. Varric crossed his arms, his expression a blend of skepticism and intrigue. "You sure it wasn't another human? They all look alike in combat gear." "I thought the same thing," Drakane said. "So I confronted him, looked him in the eye and asked, 'How?' Do you know what he said?" Varric shook his head. He just grinned and said, "Sometimes you've got to die first to find a way out." Then he walked off like nothing happened. A heavy silence settled across the room. The only sound was the slow drip of condensation from an overhead coolant pipe hitting the floor. From that moment on, everything changed. Zayed kept getting killed, again and again, and every time he came back. Sometimes it was hours later. Sometimes it was days. The Hive grew obsessed with him. They'd throw entire squads at him just to confirm the kill, but it never mattered. He always returned. A voice from the back of the room broke the tension. Immortal? No, Dracane said, his tone clipped. Not immortal, smarter. He wasn't dodging death, he was playing with it. Every encounter was a trap he'd already planned for. Every time he died, it was a distraction or a reset in his strategy. And the Hive had no idea they were playing into his hands. Varric leaned in, his eyes narrowed. You're telling me the man was using himself as bait? That's exactly what I'm telling you, Dracane said. But here's the terrifying part. The Hive thought he was some kind of deathless monster. Rumors spread through their ranks like wildfire, stories about humans who couldn't die. They became reckless, desperate, and we used that against them. He took a slow sip of his drink, letting the weight of his words settle. By the time they figured it out, it was already too late. Varric exhaled slowly, his eyes glinting in the low light. You've seen a lot of strange things, Dracane. But this... Dracane placed the glass down carefully. It's just the beginning. His voice dropped lower, colder. Because the last time I saw Zayed, we were deep inside the Hive's command core. He was supposed to die there. No tricks left, no tactics that could save him. But he didn't. He walked straight into the heart of the enemy and smiled one last time. And what happened next changed everything. Zayed walked into the Hive's core with the kind of calm I'd seen only in soldiers who'd given up on living, or knew something the rest of us didn't. Dracane's words left the air in the bar hanging heavy, the kind of tension that prickles beneath the skin. His eyes narrowed, distant yet sharp, locked in a memory so vivid it almost bled into the present. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, the ice clinking softly. The Hive never saw him coming. Neither did I. But I'll tell you what I did see. A fortress crumbling under the weight of monsters we barely understood, a planet turning to ash beneath our boots, and a human who didn't know how to stay dead. Varric leaned in further, his elbows resting on the table. What happened next? You were in the Hive core, right? Dracane's metallic fingers tightened around the glass before he set it down with deliberate care. We had 40 minutes left before the perimeter would collapse entirely. The barricades were nothing more than charred rubble by then, and the air inside the command bunker was thick with heat and the taste of metal, like breathing through wire mesh. Every breath felt like swallowing nails. The command center was chaos, alarms flashing red across the heads-up displays, officers shouting over each other, neural comms filled with broken chatter and desperate requests for reinforcements that weren't coming. He could still hear it, the distant explosions like a steady drumbeat of destruction outside. The Hive had swarmed in waves, overwhelming every line they'd tried to hold, adapting too fast for human countermeasures to keep up. Bodies, both human and alien, were piled against the fractured walls of the outpost, their forms blending into one grotesque mass under the flickering light. Command was crumbling, morale even faster. Officers were already discussing evacuation protocols, but there was nowhere to go. Venor 7 was a death sentence, and everyone knew it. And Zayed? Varric pressed. Where was he in all of this? Dracane's lips twitched, not quite a smile, more an echo of something darker. Right in the middle of it. I found him at the south access gate, weaponless, his combat suit smeared with Hive ichor, his eyes cold as slate. He was leaning against a console, scanning the tactical display like he had all the time in the world. The display had glowed blue and red, marking the remaining friendly positions in dwindling clusters, while the Hive's red markers seemed endless, spreading like a bloodstain across the battlefield map. Zayed studied it with the detached focus of a surgeon inspecting an open wound. You look too calm for a man about to die, Dracane had told him. Zayed didn't look up. I'm not about to die. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. That line had hung between them for a long second before Zayed finally glanced at him, that same crooked grin on his face, the kind that spoke of plans far bigger than the battlefield they stood on. You still want to hold this place? Zayed asked, gesturing toward the tactical display. Because I can give you 10 more minutes if you're willing to trust me. Dracane folded his arms. 10 minutes isn't enough to win a war. Zayed shrugged. 10 minutes is enough to change everything. It's enough to get inside their heads. Enough to make them afraid of us for once. And how do you plan to do that? Drakane's tone had been skeptical then, the way you speak to a man who's clearly lost his grip on reality. Zayed's grin widened. Simple. I'm going to get myself killed. In that instant, everything about the war had shifted. Zayed wasn't just another soldier. He was something else entirely, something untouchable in ways that no battlefield manual could prepare you for. His plan wasn't just reckless. It was borderline madness, Drakane said, his voice quiet now, drawing the listeners even closer. But the worst part? It worked. He could see it again, the way Zayed had walked out of that command center and into the heart of the carnage, unarmed and unflinching. Hive soldiers converged on him like bloodhounds catching a scent, their clawed limbs slicing through the air with lethal precision. And then they got him, Drakane said softly. The Hive commander, the one who'd been hunting him for days, took him down. A direct strike through the chest. There was no coming back from that one. The veterans in the bar shifted uncomfortably, their eyes betraying their own memories of similar moments, those brief flashes of horror on the battlefield when the inevitability of death grips you tight and refuses to let go. I was sure that was it, Drakane continued. I saw him hit the ground. No tricks, no second chances. The Hive left him there, a trophy for the battlefield. We had to fall back after that. We were running low on everything. Ammunition, oxygen packs, even hope. We had nothing left. He paused, his breath catching slightly, almost imperceptibly. And then, 5 hours later, just as we were mounting our last defense, there he was again, standing in the ruins of the East Corridor like death had skipped right over him. A whisper spread through the bar, disbelief woven into the air. One soldier murmured, "That's not possible." "No," Drakane said, his voice like steel. "It shouldn't be." But Zayed never cared much for what should be possible. When I asked him how he survived, do you know what he said? Varric leaned in, tension etched into the lines of his face. "What?" Drakane smiled faintly. He said, "Sometimes death is just an inconvenience." Then he reloaded his plasma rifle and walked straight back into the fight. The weight of those words settled heavy on the crowd. Even the most seasoned veterans couldn't hide their unease. It wasn't a miracle, Drakane added. It was something far worse, something the Hive couldn't understand. And the more they tried to kill him, the more they became afraid of what they couldn't kill. His eyes gleamed in the low light, the kind of glint you see in men who've seen too much. That fear is what won us those 10 minutes, but it came at a cost none of us could fully grasp. Not yet. The bar fell silent again, breath held collectively as the story lingered in the air like smoke refusing to dissipate. You ever wonder what it feels like to die? Drakane's voice cut through the thick silence, his gaze steady, almost daring someone to answer. He set his empty glass on the table with a deliberate click, his cybernetic fingers curling slightly around the rim. Zayed didn't wonder. He knew. He made it part of the plan. The veteran sat on edge, caught between disbelief and fascination. One of them, a younger soldier with burned scars on his neck, shifted uneasily. No one walks away from death that many times, not without leaving a piece of themselves behind, he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Drakane leaned forward, eyes locked on the man. You're right, he said quietly. Zayed knew that too, but what scared the Hive more wasn't that he kept coming back. It was that he seemed to get stronger every time they failed to kill him. He glanced at Varric, whose brow furrowed in thought. What you don't understand yet, Drakane continued, is that Zayed didn't just cheat death. He weaponized it. He could still see it clearly. The smoke-stained corridors of the East Wing, the air heavy with the tang of melting alloy and blood. Heads-up displays flickered in and out of sync, casting fractured blue light across the carnage. The stench of burnt armor and Hive ichor hung like a fog, clinging to every breath. The wounded groaned in makeshift triage zones as medics worked with brutal efficiency, their hands stained crimson. We were holding the last corridor, waiting for the inevitable, Drakane said, his voice calm but tense. the way a storm feels before it breaks. Hive drones had pushed us back step by step, their coordination flawless. Every time we set a trap, they adapted. Every time we tried to regroup, they cut us off. It was like fighting a swarm of minds that shared the same thought. "And Zayed?" Varric asked, his eyes narrowing. "Zayed disappeared after that last stunt in the East Corridor. No explanation, no goodbye, just gone. Left us to clean up the mess and figure out how to hold our ground with what little we had left." Drakane's jaw tightened. For 12 hours, we were on our own. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room. "I thought he'd abandoned us. I thought we were dead." Outside the bunker, the world had been reduced to ruins. Towers of flame rose into a blackened sky, their light reflecting off fields of twisted metal and fractured earth. The Hive was relentless in their pursuit, waves of drones moving like liquid fire, consuming everything in their path. By the time they reached the inner defense line, we had nothing left to give, Drakane admitted. Our munitions were nearly spent, and the laser plasma displays showed our support units falling back one by one. The Hive didn't just want to kill us, they wanted to make sure nothing remained. The sound of distant gunfire echoed in his memory, rapid and chaotic. Drakane could still feel the recoil of his weapon in his hands, the heat of each plasma shot warming his gloves. His armor was heavy with dust and sweat, the inside of his helmet slick and suffocating. He remembered every step, how the ground beneath his feet felt too soft, soaked with the blood of both friend and foe. Then, just as the Hive reached the final checkpoint, something happened that made every soldier freeze. The shadows on the walls shifted, stretching unnaturally, as if responding to a new force. A single figure emerged from the haze of battle, walking slowly, deliberately, his boots crunching over debris with a rhythmic finality. His combat suit was scarred, his helmet cracked, but his posture was relaxed, almost casual. It was Zayed. Drakane sucked in a breath as he remembered it. The way Zayed moved without urgency, his eyes scanning the battlefield like a predator measuring its prey. "He walked right through the crossfire," Drakane said, his voice low and deliberate. "Didn't even flinch when plasma bolts scorched the walls around him. He just kept walking." "What the hell was he doing?" one of the veterans asked, his voice tinged with awe. Drakane shook his head. He was letting them see him, letting the Hive know he was still alive, and they panicked. The Hive's formation collapsed almost immediately. Commanders barked incoherent orders over their comms, their movements becoming frantic, disorganized. Drones that had moved with ruthless precision moments earlier hesitated, their heads swiveling as if trying to confirm what their optics were telling them. Zayed had become a phantom, something that defied their logic, their understanding. And then he struck. Zayed wasn't just a soldier. He was a scalpel in the middle of a hurricane, Drakane continued, his eyes darkening. He hit them where it hurt most. Command nodes, energy relays, their neural links. He dismantled their entire infrastructure while the rest of us barely kept up. It wasn't a battle. It was dissection. The room grew even quieter, if that was possible. Every ear strained to catch Drakane's next words. "I cornered him after that fight," Drakane said. "Grabbed him by the arm and demanded to know how he did it, how he kept surviving when everyone else was falling around him. He just gave me that damn grin again and said, 'They think they can kill me because they haven't learned yet. Death's just a trick of timing.'" The words hit like a punch, leaving a stunned silence in their wake. "Timing?" Varric echoed, frowning. Drakane nodded slowly. Zayed had been playing a much bigger game than we'd realized. He wasn't just fighting battles. He was bending the rules, moving through time in ways we couldn't comprehend yet. One of the younger soldiers in the back shook his head in disbelief. "No one controls time like that. It's impossible." "Not impossible," Drakane corrected, "but very dangerous. And Zayed had mastered it. He'd been rewinding moments, dodging death, learning from every failure until it became second nature. Every encounter was a trial, a rehearsal until he got it right." His voice dropped to a whisper. And that was just the beginning of the chaos he was about to unleash. The bar fell silent once more, the tension palpable. Drakane's eyes glinted in the dim light, his expression unreadable. By the time we realized what he was really doing, it was already too late to stop it. He sat back, letting the weight of the moment settle. And the Hive, they had no idea what kind of storm was about to hit them. Drakane leaned back in his chair, his cybernetic fingers resting on the edge of the table, tapping once, twice, before his voice cut through the air again, steady and deliberate. Zayed wasn't just bending time, he was creating opportunities that weren't supposed to exist. Every battle was a trap he'd already set, and none of us realized we were part of it until it was too late. The bar was silent, the weight of his words pressing down on every listener like a physical force. Drinks sat untouched. Every soldier's eyes reflected something between fascination and unease. Drakane's gaze locked onto the middle distance as though staring straight through the wall, back into the chaos of Venar 7. The Hive had no idea what was happening, he said, his voice quieter now. The harder they tried to kill him, the worse it got for them. They couldn't process what they were fighting. Fear started breaking down their chain of command. You could see it in the way they moved, disjointed, frantic, and that's exactly what Zayed wanted. Outside the bunker, the air shimmered with heat, the battlefield a tapestry of flame and wreckage. Laser plasma displays crackled and flickered, overloaded with system errors as they struggled to track the swarming enemy forces. The ground was littered with half-melted Hive drones, their limbs twitching in their final moments like broken machinery. It was late in the evening, if time even mattered, in a place like Venar 7. The sky was a shifting curtain of crimson and ash, firestorms sweeping across the horizon like tidal waves of destruction. Every breath tasted like burnt metal and dust. The distant rumble of collapsing infrastructure rattled through the bunker walls, a slow, grinding reminder of how little time they had left. I thought the worst was over, Drakane continued, his voice growing colder. I thought we'd finally turned the tide. I was wrong. He paused, his eyes darkening as he remembered the moment everything changed. They pulled back, Varric frowned. The Hive doesn't retreat. Not unless they're leading you into something worse, Drakane finished, his voice heavy with the weight of that realization. They knew they couldn't kill Zayed in open combat, so they did the next best thing. They baited him. They knew we were watching him, following him into every battle like he had all the answers. So they gave us a false victory, something we couldn't resist chasing. The trap had been set with ruthless efficiency. The Hive retreated into the ruins of their own command outpost, luring Zayed and his team deep into the wreckage. The heads-up displays flashed erratic warnings across every visor, heat signatures multiplying faster than they should, power surges registering beneath the ground like pulses from something alive. Drakane had been at the front, his boots crunching over scorched stone, his rifle raised. We swept through the first few chambers without resistance. The place was a graveyard, burnt-out terminals, shattered weapon racks, walls smeared with dried Hive ichor. But the air felt wrong, thick and electric, as if the walls themselves were waiting to snap shut on us. He clenched his jaw at the memory. That's when the floor started vibrating. The vibration built quickly, rising from a subtle tremor to a rolling surge beneath their feet. The lights flickered once, twice, and then died, plunging them into darkness. The only light came from the pale glow of their tactical visors and the faint, pulsing red of emergency markers scattered along the corridor. "Move," Zayed had ordered, his voice sharp and steady. "Keep your formation tight. No one falls behind." Drakane had followed without question, his instincts screaming that something was wrong, but trusting Zayed's certainty more than his own doubts. Every step forward felt like walking into the jaws of a waiting beast. The walls seemed to close in, the air pressing down on them like a physical weight. And then the first strike hit. It came out of nowhere, Drakane said, his eyes flickering with the memory. A shockwave strong enough to throw us off our feet, followed by an explosion that tore through the corridor like a tidal wave of fire. One second we were walking, the next we were scattered like debris. He could still feel the heat of the blast searing through his armor, hear the sharp crack of collapsing metal as the ceiling caved in behind them. The comms filled with static and overlapping voices. Shouts, orders, the desperate calls of soldiers trying to regroup in the chaos. I pulled myself up, coughing through the smoke, and the first thing I saw was Zayed, Dracain said, his voice tightening. He was already on his feet, barely phased, his eyes locked on the far end of the corridor, like he could see something we couldn't. "Incoming!" someone had shouted, and then the Hive drones hit them in full force. It wasn't like the previous battles. This wasn't a skirmish or a tactical engagement. It was an ambush, coordinated and brutal. The Hive poured in from hidden side tunnels, their scythe-like limbs slashing through the smoke, plasma bolts lighting up the darkness in bursts of blue and green. Dracain fired into the mass of bodies, his shots landing with brutal precision, each impact sending a drone crumpling to the floor. The air was filled with the deafening roar of combat, every sound layered on top of the next, until it became a singular, chaotic pulse. And through it all, Zayed moved like a shadow, weaving through the chaos with uncanny precision. He didn't just fight, he orchestrated. His every movement seemed calculated, each step part of a larger strategy only he understood. He wasn't trying to kill them all, Dracain said, his voice grim. He was leading them, drawing them deeper into the facility, right where he wanted them. Varak's eyes narrowed. What was he planning? That's what I asked him, Dracain said. And do you know what he said? Varak shook his head. Dracain's lips curled into a humorless smile. Trust me, this is where it gets interesting. The memory burned in his mind, the way Zayd's voice had sounded so calm, so certain, even as the world collapsed around them. He had known exactly how this would play out, had seen the pieces move long before the game even began. But there was something else in that moment, a flicker of something darker beneath the confidence, something Dracain couldn't quite name at the time. It felt like the calm before a storm, the breath before everything unraveled. And it did, Dracain said quietly. It unraveled faster than any of us could have imagined. The bar stayed silent, the weight of his words lingering in the air like smoke. Eyes darted toward each other, hesitant, as if daring to ask the question they all shared but no one wanted to voice. Dracain's gaze hardened. We thought we were prepared for what came next. We were wrong. Trust me, Zayed had said, his voice calm against the chaos, his eyes locked onto the black depths of the collapsing corridor ahead. This is where it gets interesting. Dracain could still hear those words ringing in his head as the Hive drones closed in from every direction, their bladed limbs catching the dim red light flashing from the emergency markers. The air was thick with heat and dust, each breath dragging through his lungs like sandpaper. The walls groaned around them, straining under the weight of battle. But Zayed hadn't hesitated, not once. He moved like he'd done this 100 times before, like he had memorized every twist and turn of the collapsing fortress. His footsteps were quick but controlled, his movements almost too efficient for the chaos that surrounded them. Dracain followed, his pulse thundering in his ears, gripping his rifle so tightly his knuckles ached. Plasma bursts lit up the space in erratic bursts, illuminating fragments of the ruined corridor, the shattered remains of a laser plasma display, a mangled drone half buried in debris, the slick sheen of blood pooled beneath a fallen soldier. "Zayed!" Dracain barked, his voice barely cutting through the clamor of battle. "Where the hell are you taking us?" Zayed glanced back, a faint grin tugging at his lips. "Someplace they won't follow." That was all he said before disappearing around the next corner. Dracain clenched his jaw and pushed forward, the weight of his armor pulling on his shoulders, each step a battle against the burning fatigue threatening to slow him down. Behind him, the sound of hive claws scraping against metal echoed closer, relentless, hunting. The corridor twisted downward, narrowing into a space so tight that their helmets brushed the low ceiling. The temperature climbed with every step, the walls radiating an oppressive heat that made sweat pour down Dracain's back, soaking into his undersuit. The air reeked of something sharp and unnatural, like scorched chemicals mixed with decaying organic matter. They emerged into a cavernous chamber, a vast, hollowed-out pit deep beneath the fortress, its walls lined with pulsing organic growths that writhed faintly, almost as if alive. At the center of the chamber, a glowing mass of cables and biomachinery pulsed with rhythmic intensity, a Hive power core, alien in its design, thrumming with raw energy. Drakane's stomach twisted at the sight. "You led us straight into their heart," he said, his voice low and wary. "Exactly," Zayed said, already moving toward the core with determined steps. "This is where we break them." "Break them?" Drakane's eyes darted to the writhing walls, his instincts screaming danger. "You're out of your mind. If that core goes critical, we'll be caught in the blast zone." Zayed knelt beside the core, his fingers moving with unsettling familiarity across the glowing surface. "Trust me," he said again, his tone almost playful. "We won't be here long enough for that to matter." Drakane wanted to argue, but something in Zayed's voice, something in the absolute certainty that radiated from him, made him stop. He watched in silence as Zayed worked, his movements precise and fluid, like a man conducting a symphony no one else could hear. Minutes passed, each one stretching longer than the last. The sounds of battle grew louder above them, the tremors from distant explosions shaking dust loose from the ceiling. Drakane's heart pounded against his ribs, his senses hyper-focused on every sound, every flicker of movement in the shadows. Then suddenly Zayed stopped. He stood, wiping sweat from his brow, and turned to Drakane with a satisfied nod. "It's done," he said. "We've got 2 minutes to get clear." Drakane didn't waste time asking questions. He turned and sprinted toward the exit, his boots slamming against the metal floor with each step. Zayed was right behind him, the two of them moving in perfect sync, weaving through the labyrinthine corridors as the fortress began to shake violently around them. The core's overload sent pulses of energy surging through the structure, creating bursts of light and heat that chased them down the passageways like vengeful spirits. Pipes burst overhead, releasing scalding steam that hissed and roared, adding to the cacophony of collapsing walls and distant screams. Drakane pushed harder, his breath burning in his chest, his muscles screaming in protest. He could see the exit up ahead, a jagged opening where the corridor had caved in, revealing a narrow path to the surface. They reached it just as the first explosion rocked the ground beneath them. Drakane stumbled, catching himself on a fractured support beam, his vision swimming. Zayed grabbed his arm and pulled him forward, the two of them diving through the opening just as the entire corridor collapsed behind them in a deafening roar. Drakane hit the ground hard, the impact jarring every bone in his body. He rolled onto his back, gasping for breath, his heart hammering against his ribs. Dust and debris rained down around them, filling the air with choking clouds. For a moment, there was only silence, the heavy, oppressive kind that follows in the wake of destruction, the kind that feels like the world itself is holding its breath. Then Zayed laughed. It was a short, sharp sound, equal parts exhilaration and exhaustion. He sat up, brushing dirt from his armor, and flashed Drakane a crooked grin. "Told you it'd be interesting." Drakane stared at him, torn between the urge to punch him and the overwhelming relief that they were still alive. He settled for shaking his head. "You're insane," he muttered. "Probably," Zayed said, standing and offering him a hand. "But it worked, didn't it?" Drakane took the offered hand and let Zayed pull him to his feet. He looked back at the smoldering ruins of the fortress, the glow of the overloaded core flickering like a dying star, deep within the structure. "It worked," he admitted, his voice barely audible. But even as the words left his mouth, a cold realization settled in his gut. This wasn't the end. Not yet. The Hive wouldn't be beaten so easily. They would adapt, just like they always did. And the next time, they wouldn't be so reckless. Drakane glanced at Zayed, who was already scanning the horizon, his eyes sharp and calculating. He didn't look like a man who believed the fight was over. He looked like a man planning his next move. "What now?" Drakane asked, his voice steady despite the chaos still echoing in his head. Zayed smiled, the kind of smile that spoke of secrets yet to be revealed. "Now we finish what we started." Zayed's words still hung in the air. "Now we finish what we started." Drakane couldn't tell if it was confidence or madness that fueled the human's resolve, but it didn't matter. In that moment, they didn't have the luxury of doubt. Behind them, the core's energy pulsed like a dying star, cracks in the structure hissing with escaping pressure as it spiraled toward detonation. The fortress groaned under its own weight, walls trembling as the overload spread through the network of biomechanical veins pulsing beneath the surface. Every pulse of light from the collapsing power core painted the walls with a sinister glow, casting long, flickering shadows. The air itself seemed alive, charged, almost metallic in taste, like breathing in static before a storm. Dracane wiped sweat from his brow and adjusted his helmet, his heads-up display flickering with new warnings. His breath slowed as he scanned the scorched landscape ahead. Charred structures jutted from the rubble like broken bones, and a low vibration beneath his feet hinted at more collapses waiting to happen. His grip tightened around his rifle, fingers flexing instinctively as adrenaline sharpened his senses. His ears caught every shift in the rubble, every distant metallic snap of cooling debris. "How far?" Dracane asked, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. His pulse thrummed, but he forced himself to keep his tone even, calm in the eye of the storm. "Not far," Zayed replied without turning, his eyes locked on something ahead, calculating. He moved with that same strange confidence, weaving through fallen beams and pools of viscous black fluid without hesitation, as if the battlefield itself whispered directions only he could hear. The command core's deeper. That was just their defense grid. Dracane raised an eyebrow, keeping pace. That wasn't their core. He glanced back at the imploding section of the fortress, the cascade of collapsing structures swallowing entire chambers in rolling clouds of ash and fire. "Looked like a core to me." Zayed smirked. "Looks can be deceiving." He paused, crouching near a twisted support column, his fingers brushing the surface. The organic material pulsed weakly beneath his touch. This was a distraction. The real core is nested deeper. Hive fortresses always have redundant systems, hidden layers beneath layers. You don't think they'd leave their brain out in the open, do you? Dracane clenched his jaw. "So this whole time we've been fighting through decoys?" "Not entirely," Zayed said, standing and wiping his hands on his armor. "It's still a vital part of their network. Taking it out weakens them, makes them predictable." He tapped his helmet, adjusting his visor's scan mode. "But the real prize, their command nexus, that's what controls everything. That's what we need to destroy." A distant rumble shook the ground beneath them, sending dust and shards of biometal raining from the ceiling. Dracon glanced at the ceiling warily. "We'd better move then, before this place buries us alive." They pressed on, the air growing heavier with each step. The corridor narrowed, the walls slick with strange organic growths that pulsed faintly in rhythm with some unseen heartbeat. It felt like walking through the digestive tract of some ancient beast, each step echoing softly in the oppressive silence. The only light came from the dim, sickly green bioluminescence emanating from the walls. "You ever think they're watching us?" Dracane muttered, his eyes flicking toward the writhing tendrils along the walls. "Like the fortress itself is alive?" "They are," Zayed replied, glancing back with a knowing look. "The Hive's network is semi-sentient. Every part of the structure is connected. Bioorganic processors, living surveillance systems, adaptive response units. It's not just a building, it's an organism." Dracane swallowed hard. "Good to know." He tightened his grip on his rifle, resisting the urge to fire into the walls just to see if they would scream. They reached a circular chamber at the corridor's end, its ceiling arching high above them, supported by rib-like columns of bone and metal. The floor was marked with intricate patterns, lines of glowing blue liquid that converged in the center, where a massive column of biomechanical machinery rose from the ground, humming with energy. Heads-up displays flickered, glitching as they tried to process the structure's dense data signature. "This is it," Zayed said, his voice almost reverent. "The Nexus." Dracane's gut twisted at the sight. "It's bigger than I expected." Zayed chuckled softly, stepping toward the Nexus. "Everything about the Hive is. They don't do anything small." He unslung a cylindrical device from his back, its surface etched with strange symbols and glowing seams of energy. Once this baby connects to their neural network, it'll trigger a cascade failure. The whole system will eat itself from the inside out. "And what happens to us?" Dracane asked, his eyes narrowing. Zayd's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "We've got about 60 seconds to make a run for it before the feedback reaches critical mass. More than enough time, if we move fast." Dracane didn't miss the flicker of uncertainty in Zayd's expression, but he nodded. 60 seconds, got it." Zayd knelt by the Nexus, his fingers dancing across the surface of the column, inserting the device with a satisfying click. The chamber trembled, a low vibration building as the Nexus pulsed with increasing intensity. "Here we go," Zayd muttered. The walls began to ripple, the patterns on the floor shifting and glowing brighter as the Nexus reacted to the foreign device. A high-pitched whine filled the air, rising steadily in pitch, making the hairs on Dracane's neck stand on end. His visor lit up with new warnings: neural feedback overload, system instability, structural collapse imminent. "Time to move!" Zayd shouted, bolting toward the exit. Dracane was right behind him, his boots slamming against the floor with each step. The chamber began to disintegrate around them, chunks of biometal crashing down, fissures splitting open beneath their feet. The air was a swirling chaos of light and sound, the Nexus screaming as it tore itself apart. They hit the corridor running, the world collapsing behind them. Dracane didn't dare look back. He didn't need to. He could feel the destruction chasing them, a wave of raw energy that threatened to consume everything in its path. "Faster!" Zayd barked, his voice cutting through the noise. Dracane pushed harder, his lungs burning, his legs screaming in protest. The exit loomed ahead, a narrow opening barely visible through the clouds of dust and debris. They dove through it just as the corridor behind them imploded in a deafening roar, the shockwave throwing them to the ground. Dracane coughed, rolling onto his back, every muscle in his body trembling. He could barely hear over the ringing in his ears. But when he glanced at Zayd, he saw the human was laughing again, short, breathless, and wild. "You know," Dracane said between gasps, "I'm starting to think you enjoy this a little too much." Zayd grinned, wiping soot from his face. "Maybe. But you've got to admit, this is one hell of a way to make a point." Dracane sat up, his eyes narrowing at the distant glow of the collapsing Nexus. "Let's hope it was worth it." Zayd's grin faded slightly, his eyes glinting in the dim light. "Oh, it will be," he said quietly. "One way or another, the Hive just learned what it means to fear us." The glow of the collapsing Nexus lit up the horizon like a rising inferno, painting the night in sickly reds and burning oranges. Dracane pulled himself to his feet, every joint aching, the world spinning for a brief moment before it righted itself. His visor flickered, warning after warning flashing across the heads-up display. Structural failure detected, seismic instability, neural interference. He ignored them all. His focus was on Zayd, who stood at the edge of the crumbling corridor, his eyes scanning the devastation with an unnerving calm. "We're not done," Zayd said, his voice firm but calm, a steady anchor in the chaos. "This isn't the end game. The Hive will recover if we don't push further." Dracane tightened his grip on his rifle. His body screamed for rest, but he knew Zayd was right. The Hive wasn't a force you could hit once and walk away from. They learned. They adapted. If they left now, everything they'd gained would be wiped out in days. "How much time do we have before they regroup?" Dracane asked, already calculating their next move. "Not long. Minutes, maybe," Zayd replied, wiping sweat from his brow. His face was smeared with dust and soot, but his eyes were clear, sharp with purpose. "They'll redirect their remaining units toward the upper command layers. That's where the real battle is going to be." Dracane nodded slowly, his mind piecing together the fragmented battlefield map still active on his visor. The upper layers of the Hive fortress were a labyrinth of interconnected chambers, each one a potential kill box if the enemy controlled the choke points. They'd need to move fast and smart to avoid getting trapped. "Then we hit the command spire," Dracane said, pointing to the distant outline of the fortress's upper structure. "If we take that, we cut off their remaining forces from the central network. We won't just weaken them, we'll collapse their entire response grid." Exactly, Zayed said, his lips curling into that familiar, dangerous grin. But we'll need a distraction to make it work. A voice crackled through Dracane's comm, cutting through the static. Captain Dracane, this is Kalen from the southern perimeter. We're barely holding. Reinforcements are spread thin. What's your status? Dracane tapped his comm unit, his voice steady. Kalen, listen carefully. I need you to pull back your forces and regroup at the southeast entrance. I'm sending you the coordinates now. Set up defensive emplacements and hold that position at all costs. We're moving on the command spire. Understood, Kalen replied, though the tension in his voice was clear. We'll hold as long as we can. Good luck. Dracane cut the comm and turned back to Zayed. We'll need to move fast. If Kalen's group can hold the southeast entrance, we can funnel the remaining Hive forces into a choke point. That should give us just enough time to breach the spire. Zayed nodded, already checking his gear. I'll handle the entry point. You focus on securing the top. Once we're inside, stick to the plan. Disable the relay nodes, collapse the central core, and get out before everything goes critical. They moved quickly, each step filled with urgency but calculated precision. The ground beneath them trembled, aftershocks rippling from the overloaded Nexus core. They navigated through the ruined sections of the fortress, using the debris to their advantage, moving through shadows, avoiding open ground. The spire loomed closer with every step, its surface glistening with the same biomechanical texture that pulsed faintly, feeding energy into the network that still fought to repair itself. A dozen Hive drones patrolled the base, their insect-like limbs clicking softly against the metallic surface. Dracane raised his fist, signaling for Zayed to hold. His eyes swept the area, noting the overlapping fields of fire from the drones' plasma weapons. They couldn't afford a direct fight here. It would draw too much attention. Zayed crouched beside him, his voice barely a whisper. We could hit their power junctions along the outer wall, create a blackout and slip through while they're blind. Do it, Draken said, his gaze never leaving the patrol pattern of the nearest drones. Zayed moved with practiced ease, slipping into the shadows like a ghost. Moments later, the power grid flickered, and the patrol lights died. The drones froze for a brief second, their optics adjusting to the sudden darkness. It was all the opening Draken needed. Go, he ordered, and they moved as one. Not long. Minutes, maybe, Zayed replied, wiping sweat from his brow. His face was smeared with dust and soot, but his eyes were clear, sharp with purpose. They'll redirect their remaining units toward the upper command layers. That's where the real battle is going to be. Dracane nodded slowly, his mind piecing together the fragmented battlefield map still active on his visor. The upper layers of the Hive fortress were a labyrinth of interconnected chambers, each one a potential kill box if the enemy controlled the choke points. They'd need to move fast and smart to avoid getting trapped. Then we hit the command spire, Dracane said, pointing to the distant outline of the fortress's upper structure. If we take that, we cut off their remaining forces from the central network. We won't just weaken them, we'll collapse their entire response grid. Exactly, Zayed said, his lips curling into that familiar, dangerous grin. But we'll need a distraction to make it work. A voice crackled through Dracane's comm, cutting through the static. Captain Dracane, this is Kalen from the southern perimeter. We're barely holding. Reinforcements are spread thin. What's your status? Dracane tapped his comm unit, his voice steady. Kalen, listen carefully. I need you to pull back your forces and regroup at the southeast entrance. I'm sending you the coordinates now. Set up defensive emplacements and hold that position at all costs. We're moving on the command spire. Understood, Kalen replied, though the tension in his voice was clear. We'll hold as long as we can. Good luck. Dracane cut the comm and turned back to Zayed. We'll need to move fast. If Kalen's group can hold the southeast entrance, we can funnel the remaining Hive forces into a choke point. That should give us just enough time to breach the spire. Zayed nodded, already checking his gear. I'll handle the entry point. You focus on securing the top. Once we're inside, stick to the plan. Disable the relay nodes, collapse the central core, and get out before everything goes critical. They moved quickly, each step filled with urgency but calculated precision. The ground beneath them trembled, aftershocks rippling from the overloaded Nexus core. They navigated through the ruined sections of the fortress, using the debris to their advantage, moving through shadows, avoiding open ground. The spire loomed closer with every step, its surface glistening with the same biomechanical texture that pulsed faintly, feeding energy into the network that still fought to repair itself. A dozen Hive drones patrolled the base, their insect-like limbs clicking softly against the metallic surface. Dracane raised his fist, signaling for Zayed to hold. His eyes swept the area, noting the overlapping fields of fire from the drones' plasma weapons. They couldn't afford a direct fight here. It would draw too much attention. Zayed crouched beside him, his voice barely a whisper. We could hit their power junctions along the outer wall, create a blackout and slip through while they're blind. Do it, Draken said, his gaze never leaving the patrol pattern of the nearest drones. Zayed moved with practiced ease, slipping into the shadows like a ghost. Moments later, the power grid flickered, and the patrol lights died. The drones froze for a brief second, their optics adjusting to the sudden darkness. It was all the opening Draken needed. Go, he ordered, and they moved as one. Dracane adjusted his rifle, feeling the comforting weight of it in his hands. So what now? We've crippled their network, torn apart their command spire. What's left to finish? Zayed's expression darkened, his eyes taking on a distant, almost haunted look. What's left? Everything. You think they'll let this go? Number the Hive learns fast, and right now, we've just taught them what we're capable of. But there's one lesson they still need to learn, the one they'll never recover from. The wind stirred, carrying the scent of burnt metal and scorched earth, and for a moment all Dracane could hear was the faint crackle of distant fires. He stared at Zayed, searching for some sign of hesitation, some hint that this man might still be bound by the same rules they all followed. But there was nothing, just a cold, relentless determination. You've got a plan, Dracane said, his voice low. Don't you? Zayed nodded slowly. Always. But it's not just my plan, it's ours. This time we hit them where it truly hurts, their memory core, the heart of their species. We erase everything they've learned, everything they've adapted to, and we leave them scrambling in the dark. Dracane felt the weight of those words settle on his shoulders. The Hive wasn't just a collection of soldiers, it was a shared consciousness, a network of minds that evolved and learned faster than any individual could. Destroying the memory core would be like severing the brain from the body. The drones would still exist, but they'd be lost, directionless. It's suicide, Dracane said quietly. You know that, right? Zayed chuckled, the sound sharp and bitter. It's only suicide if we don't win. But if we pull it off, we end this war here and now. The words hung between them, heavy and final. Dracane glanced back at the distant battlefield, the smoke rising in jagged columns, the broken remnants of their enemies retreating into the shadows. He knew what was coming, what it would take to finish this. And yet, something inside him stirred, something primal, something that refused to back down. We'll need every remaining unit to coordinate this, Dracane said, his voice steady now. The memory core will be heavily guarded. If we're going to break through, we'll have to hit them from all sides at once, no second chances. Good, Zayed said, his grin returning, though it was sharper now, more dangerous. I've always preferred doing things the hard way. Dracane tapped into the comms, his voice carrying the full weight of command. Kalen, patch me through to all units. This is it. This is where we end it. The channel buzzed to life, filled with the voices of exhausted but resolute soldiers. You've all fought harder than anyone could ask. I'm not going to tell you this will be easy. It won't. But we have one chance to break the Hive's spine. We're going after their memory core. We take that, and they'll never recover. They'll fall apart, piece by piece, and we'll be there to finish the job. There was a moment of silence, the weight of his words settling in. Then Kalen's voice cut through the static, strong and steady. We're with you, Captain, all the way. The response came in waves, affirmations from every squad, voices hardened by battle, but unbroken. Dracane felt a spark of pride, sharp and fierce. These weren't just soldiers. They were survivors, warriors forged in the crucible of war. "Then let's finish what we started," Dracane said, cutting the comm. He looked at Zayed, his eyes gleaming with that same fire. "Lead the way, human." The assault on the memory core was nothing short of brutal. The Hive fought like cornered beasts, their desperation bleeding into every attack. The ground shook with each explosion, the air thick with energy discharges that lit up the dark like flashes of lightning. Dracane's visor overloaded twice from the intensity, forcing him to fight half-blind through corridors filled with flashing lights and the smell of burning metal. Zayed was everywhere, moving through the chaos like a ghost, his blade flashing in arcs of blue light, his voice calm and sharp as he issued orders. Every step they took was hard-won, every inch paid for in blood and fire. But they pushed forward, relentless, unstoppable. They reached the core at the heart of the Hive's deepest chamber, a pulsing sphere of light and data, its surface covered in shifting patterns like a living tapestry. It hummed with power, each pulse sending waves of energy rippling through the floor. Zayed approached it slowly, his eyes never leaving the core. "This is it," he said, his voice soft but certain. "The end of everything they've ever known." Dracane stood beside him, his rifle raised, his finger hovering over the trigger. "Are you sure about this?"